Thank you. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar on civil-military relations. It's a topic of perennial interest in American politics, and I think of particularly salient interest in recent times. Today we have two very distinguished speakers. We have, first of all, Christopher Gelpi, who is director of the Mershon Center for International Security Studies. He's chair of peace studies and conflict resolution and professor of political science. And he has written on the subject of civil-military relations, and I'm sure he will share some of the knowledge he has garnered. The second, we have one of our Ph.D. candidates, Mr. Andrew Goodhart, who is studying international order, but importantly, he is an experienced hand who has worked in the Department of Defense in strategic studies and has also written on the subject of civil-military relations. We're going to start with Andy, who is going to give us a quick introduction to civil-military relations, followed by remarks on his experience in government, how others in government talk about civil-military relations, and gaps in our understanding of the relationship between military and civil personnel. Chris Gelpi, in turn, will share some slides he has on the history of civil-military relations and the implications for the future of civil-military relations. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Andrew and then to Chris, and then we'll come back and be sure to start lodging questions on chat. Very good. Go ahead, Andy.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Caldeira, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences for hosting and for inviting me to participate. My name's Andy Goodhart, so I'm a PhD candidate here, and I served as a civil servant at the Defense Department from 2008 to 2016. I was at a variety of positions at DoD, starting as a civilian for the Army staff. So I had an interesting position. I was the only civilian in my organization, the only person that was not either in active duty or on active duty at the time, or was retired from active duty. And so that was an interesting sort of exposure to the military. I then moved from the Army staff to work for the Defense Policy Organization, which sits just below the Secretary of Defense and provides the policy planning and implementation function as a counterpart to the Joint Staff. So two caveats are in order in terms of my perspective. So my experience is overwhelmingly with commissioned officers, and most at a fairly senior level, so major and above. And so these are people that are really sort of a very narrow slice of the military community. They're exceptionally well educated. They're relatively senior, in some cases very senior. And so I had very little exposure to junior officers, non-commissioned officers, or enlisted. And so I imagine that probably shapes my perspective a bit. I also wasn't in government for the Trump years, and so I can't speak directly to that experience, but I'll talk about some trends that I think intersect usefully with issues that we've talked a lot about during the Trump presidency. And so I'd like to suggest that we think about civil relations and potential problems in civil relations in sort of four buckets, if you will. You know, the first is the possibility of a military coup, right? So this is sort of the classic problem that civ-mil scholars try to get their arms around. It's fundamentally about, you know, how do you exert civilian control over the military? So I'll talk about that, and that's an area that I'm not actually worried about at all in the United States. The second issue is the possibility that civilians will use the military irresponsibly, and what the military's role is in sort of resisting that irresponsible use of their power. Third, I'll talk about potential undue military influence on policy, right? So are the military members staying in their lane? Are they providing the sort of, you know, professional expertise that we expect from them without sort of getting too far into the policy space? And that's an area that I'm actually a bit concerned about. I'll talk a bit about why and what I think we can do. And then finally, I'll talk a bit about civilian attitudes toward the military, whether they're healthy, and sort of what healthy civilian attitudes toward the military might look like. So there was a lot of discussion around the election, even in 2016, about, excuse me, so there's a lot of discussion around the 2020 election, excuse me, I'm skipping ahead, about this possibility of a military coup. right? So there was, there were statements from retired General Flynn about the possibility of imposing martial law to rerun the election and achieve a more favorable result for outgoing President Trump. And I'll say that there's nothing that I've seen in my experience in the US government that makes me worry at all that the military will mount a challenge to the legal order or to the democratic process in the United States. I just don't worry about that at all. It's not because they couldn't, right? So that's sort of the fundamental question or the fundamental problem of civil relations is how do you take an organization that is powerful enough to counter foreign adversaries and then prevent them from countering the domestic political process in which civilians are primary. And the answer traditionally has been norms of professionalism. And I think in the United States, those norms are incredibly strong. So I don't worry there at all. Just to give you a couple of anecdotal examples, I worked really closely and, in many cases for long hours and over long periods of time with military officers, got to know them really well. In many cases, these were, personal friends and friends of the family now. And in many cases, I would not know their political views, both in a professional context or privately when we would spend time together. There are a number of cases in which officers would not vote because they saw it as part of their commitment to political neutrality. There's a debate about that, about whether that's required or not, but that gives you a kind of a flavor for the sort of the culture around military professionalism in the officer corps at that level. And so that's the first issue. I don't worry about coups. The second issue is this possibility that the military might be asked to do things that are improper by civilian leaders. And so before the 2016 election, Trump talked about the possibility that he would order the military to commit war crimes. There was a discussion of perhaps targeting the family members of terrorists overseas. And that prompted this discussion of what sorts of orders the military might be empowered or required to resist. And a case of war crimes is really the easy case because that's illegal, right? So it's very clear, it would be a very clear violation of international and domestic law. The military is well trained to resist and ignore those sorts of orders. But the tricky cases, in my view, come in when an order is formally legal, but immoral. And then it prompts this question of how much autonomy we want to give a military officer in their ability to evaluate the morality of a decision or of an order as they're deciding whether to carry it out or not. And that's where I think things get a bit more complicated. Finally, there were concerns about uses of the military that perhaps were for partisan political gain by President Trump. And so one example that came up very prominently was the former president's desire for a military parade on the 4th of July. And my personal take, and people disagree on this, including people smarter than me, but my personal take is that we sort of overstate the danger of this case. I see it as a wasteful use of U.S. resources at a time when resources are scarce. But I don't see it as a sort of a slide into an impending military dictatorship or some sort of autocracy. But I'm open to other views and would love to chat more about that in the Q&A. The third area, and this is where I do actually have some real concerns, is the risk of undue military influence on policy. And so one of the things that we see both in other periods of government, and I saw it personally in my time in government, is that when the civilian leadership is weak, military officers tend to press their position, right? They operate like other bureaucratic factions. This isn't, mounting a coup. It's just the military makes up a bureaucratic faction within the larger government. And so they will occasionally have positions that, are different than their civilian counterparts. And so when there's a bit of a power vacuum, they move into that. And this is a problem that's well known. One of the sort of proposed solutions to dealing with this is to erect a very sharp barrier between the military that provides professional military advice and the civilian policymakers that sort of deliver strategic guidance fully formed to the military and then get the recommendations for how to implement it. My personal take is that doesn't work terribly well. It sounds good in practice, or in theory, but in practice, it's a much more sort of interactive process that has to take place. And so, some people have described it as a kind of a chicken and an egg where civilian decision makers are trying to explore what's in the art of the possible. And so they have to be able to have that ongoing dialogue with military officers. But there is a tension. We hope it's a productive tension, but there's definitely a tension there. My personal view is that the best thing that we can do to avoid that sort of overreach into the policy space by the military is to have a much more professional and well-supported civilian staff than we sometimes do, right? So the folks in the civil service at the Defense Department are very, very capable. I think they're very professional. So at various times when civilian leadership is weak, they lack top cover, and they also tend to be more junior than their military counterparts, which can create some difficulty in fulfilling their role as well as they might. And then finally, the area that I want to finish with is the question of civilian attitudes toward the military. And this is where I think we really have an unhealthy civilian-military dynamic. And so my take on this is that we, as a society, we've come to a place where we lionize the military, right? So we're effusive about them. Everyone in uniform is a hero, and there's a sort of a noble part of that, which is to support people that are making important contributions, and in many cases sacrificing a great deal to do it. But I think there's also a superficial component to it frequently. And basically, we lionize the military in a way that relieves us of our need to understand them, to get to know them, to engage with them. And I fear that adoration prevents us from getting to a really healthy discussion of how to use the military, what sort of military we need, when it should be used, and how. And finally, I think we risk a slide into a situation in which we see the military not as a means of achieving a safe, vibrant civil society, but as the goal of that society. And I think that would be a shift in norms that would be very dangerous for a democracy. I'm over time, and I know Dr. Gelpi has some great slides. I will leave it there. I'm happy to revisit any of these issues during the Q&A, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Andy. That was really fantastic. I appreciate it a lot, and I think we'll connect well to some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all to show you a little bit of some of the work that I did a few years ago on civil-military relations and how it might be relevant today. Let's see. Hopefully that works, and then people can see me now. So somebody send me a message in the chat if you can't see my slides or me on the screen. But I wanted to just sort of start by illustrating for people, and this builds off of what Andy was talking about, this kind of triangular relationship that I think is central to democratic governance in a world where self-defense is necessary, and that we have these three constituencies of the military, government, and the population, and that they all need to be in relation to one another, and both informing one another's behavior and restraining one another, so that we have this kind of checks and balances around each of these, in order to be able to sustain this balance between representative government that represents the interests and values of the public, as well as being able to operate effectively in the international system in order to keep ourselves secure as a country. And that's a difficult balancing act. And I think this is the set of relationships that we're looking at. One of the key things that then we're talking about today is really the extent to which the relationship between the government and the military is healthy, and how that can ensure good policy making, and can ensure policy making that is representative of the interests of the people. And our founders wrote a lot about this as they were thinking about the Constitution. It's written into the Constitution, and civil military control was something that that the founders were very concerned about from the beginning, but it's really been something that I would argue America has struggled with throughout its history. Going back to one of the main authors, founding authors on civil military relations and political science is Samuel Huntington, and he talks about two different types of mechanisms of civilian control of the military that are critical. The first is what he calls objective control, and this is actual institutional oversight, right? This is like Congress actually holding meetings where military needs to report to them on policy and investigating military behavior. And the second is subjective control, and that is the extent to which the military and the civilian leadership are drawn from a set of overlapping experiences and social groups so that they share common values and preferences and so on. And actually, at the time the Constitution was written, the primary emphasis was on subjective control. That is, most of the people in government had military experience, and it was expected to be able to have this healthy relationship because of that. What I want to argue to you is that over the last 50 years or so, we've had a pretty significant erosion of both objective and subjective mechanisms of civilian control in the United States. In terms of objective control, we have lost our Congress has sort of lost the ability to oversee the military in ways that, for example, used to be much more common back in the 1960s and 70s, but especially with the Vietnam War, Congress starts to basically opt out of its real oversight capacity over the military because it becomes politically charged to do that, and so that leaves civilian control really resting in the hands of what Huntington called subjective controls, or the extent to which we had people in Congress and in the government who also had military experience and were connected to the military. And for a time, that was the case, because as you can see in the graph that's right above my head, we have had over the last 40 years a severe decline in the proportion of our elected representatives who have actually had military experience. So what kind of difference does this make for civil military relations in the United States? Well, I agree with Andy that I don't think we need to worry about a coup. I don't think we need to worry about any kind of egregious collapse in that way. But what has happened is that we've developed the potential for a real military gap that can result either in as the two problems that Andy was pointing out, either excessive military sort of input into civilian policymaking and preventing civilians from expressing their policy preferences, or reckless civilian use of the military. And some research that I did a number of years ago suggests that now that we have this huge gap in experience between the civilian and military authorities, that there are hugely different opinions between military officers and civilian leadership about what the military should be doing. So this is two graphs about the extent to which both military leaders and civilian leaders support humanitarian international missions and realpolitik, or more traditional foreign policy missions. So the slide on the left is the support for humanitarian missions in foreign policy. And the categories there, this is survey data from elite military officers, civilians who are working in professional military organizations, civilians who are veterans, and elite civilians. So this is people in Congress, people in the State Department and so on, who are not veterans. And what you can see is that the civilians who are not veterans are just radically different than the people who have connections to the military in terms of their support for humanitarian operations. And then flipped around to our more traditional foreign policy objectives, again, what you can see is elite military officers on the left, civilians who have never served in the military on the right. You can see just radically different opinions about the importance of traditional military objectives like defending our allies against invasion and so on. So we have very different foreign policy agendas for those who have and have not served in the military. We also have very different agendas for how the United States should be using force in international relations. So we asked a question about the so-called Powell Doctrine, which is the notion that when the United States uses military force, it should do so overwhelmingly. So we should not intervene in small ways. We should, if we're going to use military force, it should be massive. And again, here you see all of our respondents, and these are all people in the Pentagon and in the professional military academy, or in leadership positions in the elite who have served in the military. All of those folks are very supportive of the Powell Doctrine. They're go big or go home. We either America's in and we fight a war, or we don't go in. But you can see on the right-hand side that elite civilians who have no connection to the military don't share this view at all. And instead, they are much more willing to support American uses of military force that are what we would call surgical or small-scale uses of force. And what I think this actually creates is a big divide in the conduct of American foreign policy. So what we did is we looked over American history, and we looked at how often the United States used military force, and we looked at how many veterans were serving in civilian government. So this is data from the percentage of veterans in the cabinet and the House. And what you can see is that the more veterans there are in office, the less likely the United States is to use military force. That dropped from a 4.5% probability down to about a 0.5% probability. May not seem like a huge change, but it's overall about a 90% reduction in the risk that the United States will use military force in any particular case. So most of the time, the US is obviously not using military force, but there's still a very large effect for military serving in office, really reducing to American use of force to very sort of limited numbers of missions. And at the same time, having veterans in office also has the opposite effect on how severe the or how large the use of military force is by the United States. So in cases where we have large numbers of veterans serving in office, we see much higher likelihood that the US will use force on a very large scale going to war, as opposed to a smaller scale use of force. So what does this mean in conclusion? I think what we've seen over the last 40 years or so is a real erosion of the mechanisms of civilian control over the military. And this creates a real tension at the core of American politics that has created sort of tension over policy, and in particular over foreign policy and the use of military force. So we see that those who have not served in the military have a very different vision of America's role in the world. That's a role that sees America as intervening in lots of different types of circumstances, but with very limited uses of force. Whereas those who've served in the military believe that America should be intervening in a very limited set of circumstances, but with a very large use of force. And so we're constantly caught in this tension in the conduct of our foreign policy. And I think if you look at American foreign policy over the last 20 years or so, 20, 30 years, you can see that we've been dominated by civilian non-veterans. And that's what's created the pattern of American foreign policy over the last 30 years. Even more so, I would say, than left-right divide, that this divide between civilian and military is a much larger divide even than partisanship over how America should use force. And with that, I will end there. I'm happy to take your questions about that or about anything else civil military, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thanks.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I'll pick a couple that were sent in earlier. One is, how does a member of the military decide on what is an illegal order? And let me amplify that by, you mentioned, Andy, that the gray area is where an order is immoral, and what is to be done about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So fortunately, on the question of legality, there's a well institutionalized legal cadre within the military. So there's the JAG Corps. So that if an officer receives an order and suspects that it may not be legal, they take it to their JAG Corps, and they give a legal determination on whether it's legal or not. And so that's a fairly straightforward process. In terms of the question of morality, it becomes more difficult. And so we could imagine cases that would make it maybe intuitively appealing for military officers to refuse an order based on immorality. So imagine something that an officer might be ordered to do that would fall short of the legal definition of torture, but that we would generally regard as being immoral. That would be sort of the strong argument in favor of giving military members that sort of authority to decide. I think the downside then is that effectively what you've done is you've created an opening where the military is weighing the sort of the moral and the policy or political costs and benefits of different behaviors, rather than that debate taking place within the civilian space. And so I would personally be more concerned with sort of the slippery argument. And I'll give one example. So the Trump administration was very publicly critical and skeptical of the NATO commitment. And there was long and wide-ranging discussion about what both the president's personal position toward Russia was, and then what the administration's position toward Russia was. In some cases, they didn't seem to quite align super well. And the skepticism of NATO and of engagement with allies was sometimes framed in moral terms. And you would hear discussions without sort of getting into like a conspiracy sort of theory of the deep state or something like that. I don't think that's a sort of a reasonable argument to make. But there were these discussions that maybe the military would help save us from Trump's bad decision making, and I think that's a very, very dangerous road to go down. And so in my view, the civilian leaders, up to and including the president, have this right to be wrong, is the term that Peter Feaver uses. And so like that's really fundamental, right? People get to elect bad leaders, and those leaders get to institute bad policies, and we shouldn't look to them, in my view, shouldn't look to the military as a sort of get out of jail free card.
Chris, do you want to chime in on that?
No, I mean, I think I agree 100% with what one that Andy had to say on that one. I think that covers it. Yeah.
Here's one for probably Chris, but maybe both of you. To what do you attribute the decrease in veterans serving in Congress or in the administrative state?
I do think that's primarily the onset of the All-Volunteer Force in 1973. So, if you look at if you think back to the graph that I had about the decline there, most of those folks on the left-hand side of that graph were in Congress. They were veterans in World War II or maybe Korea. And with the onset of the All-Volunteer Force, it used to be that going into the military was then a pathway. You'd serve there for a couple of years, and that would be a pathway onto a political career. So the John Kennedys of the world and things like that. And that just is no longer the case after 1973, right? You don't, if you want to go into politics, you don't go into the military, you go to law school. And so I think that was a really profound decision for the United States also, because I think that same choice, and it's really rooted in the American experience in Vietnam and the pressure that they were getting about casualties in Vietnam. But that choice then creates the situation that Andy was talking about earlier, about the way that we have this kind of dual lionized and yet alienated view of the military, that that civilians don't know anything about the military. They don't, in all honesty, want to know anything about the military or really get too close to them, because it's not as I showed in some of my slides. There's a gap in values and in life experiences. But at the same time, they feel sort of guilty that they're asking these other people basically to spend their lives, right, going around the planet, doing missions that we ask them to do. And so you get this, I think, as Andy rightly said, unhealthy tension between total alienation from and disinterest in the military, and yet kind of this militaristic lionization. So yeah, the all-volunteer force was a really a consequential choice for American foreign policy.
I don't recall, Chris, do you know whether this consequence was considered at the time that the draft was abolished and we went to a volunteer military?
That certainly wasn't the driving force, right? The driving force was a joint agreement between, at least my perception, I'd be interested, I don't know if Andy's perspective is on this, but a joint agreement on this policy for somewhat different reasons, right? So from the politician's side, this is really useful for them because it takes pressure off of them for Vietnam, right? They'd already had to go to the draft lottery, and they're getting a lot of pressure for casualties, and so this lets the pressure off of them for that. And from the military's perspective, as an organization, they have incentives to want to professionalize, right? And so that means having people come in for careers like the people Andy was working with, are there, spending their whole career. And so having people come in for 2 years of service and go to Vietnam and then come out, that doesn't help the military in its own sort of professional mission. So there's a combined sort of bureaucratic interest between civilians and the military to do this as a good solution. I don't think they did it because they thought it would make good policy.
Go ahead, Andy, do you want to say something?
Well, I would just agree. I would agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Gelpi, and just add that I think it would, from just like a functional perspective, it makes sense to have a conscript army if you think you need huge numbers of men and women under arms, and ones that are perhaps more lightly trained and more equipped in a more basic way. And I think we've seen the opposite trend toward smaller numbers of people that are more highly trained with more sophisticated equipment. And so just the functional needs of the military trend in the other direction as well.
Andrew, you talked about that at the level below the secretary, at times weak civilian the caliber of the civilians was not up to that of their military opposites. Can you talk about why that's the case? And then follow on, we have a question about having a military man as the secretary and to what extent that makes a difference.
Yeah, those are great questions. So I should say that the civilian leadership is frequently really, really excellent. And so I think the team that is coming in right now has some folks, many of whom I've worked with, they're just really incredible. So Dr. Hicks just started today as deputy secretary, and that to me is sort of she's sort of the epitome of someone who is just an incredibly capable civilian who's in exactly the right place in my view. That's my judgment, having worked for in a number of capacities. I think where we end up having trouble is that the civilian political leadership are just on a different cycle than the military folks are. And so with any civilian administration, there's an end point to it. And so in the same way that a president can become a lame duck president, a secretary of defense or an undersecretary or an assistant secretary, any level of political leadership in the Pentagon can become kind of a lame duck. And so the military officers that are working with them have the ability to sort of wait them out or to slow roll for contentious political issues. That's one thing that happens. Another thing that happens is you tend to get the A team at the beginning of an administration. In most administrations, I think, we've seen some exceptions, but, generally you get the A team at the beginning, and at the end of an administration, particularly one that lasts 8 years, you've got the B team or the C team. It's more mixed. There are some really good folks that are maybe more junior that excel in the role, and you've got others that perhaps, wouldn't have been chosen, from the top of the heap. So that's a dynamic that happens. The other thing that happens sort of below the political level, so I've been talking about political appointees in senior positions. The other thing that happens is that at more junior positions, the civilians just tend to be much more junior and much younger than their military counterparts. And so, like, I'll put myself in this position, right? So I was a GS-15 at 32. And so my protocol counterparts were colonels and captains in the Navy case. And I don't think there's a colonel or a captain in the world that thinks a 32-year-old GS-15 is his peer. And so that's a challenge that we work with. I think I did the job well. I certainly tried. Many folks in those positions do the job exceptionally well, but it does bake in a tension because there's just sort of an asymmetry in this sort of life position that people are in. And so that's something that we just have to work through.
Is that something that has been true generally or more recent phenomenon?
That's a great question. I actually don't know. I'm not sure. My experience is too limited to say for sure. I will say that it's varied, right? So there is variation in how old folks are in those positions. I know we had McKinsey come in and do a review of our HR within the policy organization while I was there, because there were some concerns about retention and training and so on. And one of the interesting things that stood out for me was that the retention period for civilians in those sorts of jobs, I don't remember the exact figure. I want to say it was maybe 5 or 6 years, which is not incredibly long. Like, if this is sort of a hobby horse of mine, but the U.S. civil service is much less professionalized and institutionalized than other countries in our position. And so we tend not to train and recruit, or train, train, and then retain people as experts in their lanes, right? We treat everybody as a generalist. And so that has, I think, some benefits. You tend to know everybody in that sort of a community, but it has some disadvantages in that you hit the work with less weight because you're not an expert at it.
I would also just add, I think generally the United States invests very heavily in our military, and we have a very professionalized, very capable military. And Andy was talking about the officers he was working with. We do not invest in any way that heavily in all kinds of aspects of the civilian part of the state. And we've been investing less and less and less in those other areas. So you look at, like, and this isn't where exactly Randy was working or anything, but you look at the gutting of the State Department and things like that civilian bureaucratic expertise is not valued in anything like the way military expertise is valued.
And if I can just pile onto that very briefly, I'm sorry, I want to be sensitive to time, but I think that we end up with a vicious cycle there, where civilian expertise isn't valued as much, and so it's not funded, and so then you end up with less civilian expertise, and so then it's valued less, and so you end up both with like a downward spiral on the quality of the civilian support that you have, and then you also end up looking to the military for advice on things that they're really not professionally equipped to give advice on.
So is the Chris, you noted the decline of the ability of Congress to oversee the military effectively. Is that due to more than the decline of the number of vets in Congress, or is it a more general institutional change?
I think it's both. So I do think that there were certain members of Congress, like somebody like a John McCain, who could, in a military briefing with a with a military officer, could have some level of legitimacy and expertise in pushing back against military briefings in ways that are hard that's hard for a lot of civilian leaders to do. But I also think there's a political aspect to it. So if you think about something like the War Powers Act, Congress is basically made a calculated choice that it's politically dangerous for them to get out in front of these kind of big foreign policy decisions about the use of force, and it's safer for them to sit in the back seat and be backseat drivers and complain when things don't go well. So it's a combination of a lack of expertise, but also, I think, political incentives.
We have several questions that deal in one way or the other with political involvement. One has to do with participation by retired generals or high-level commissioned officers, and that's a good start.
Yeah, thank you for reflagging that. I think I failed to answer that before. So I think someone asked about Secretary Austin. You know, I think this is one of those areas that's not super clear cut and dry. You know, my view is that you only get one Secretary of Defense at a time. You get one National Security Advisor at a time. And the job is just too important and too difficult and too complicated to not have the best human capital that we have in the country. And so my personal take is we should pick the very best people for those roles, regardless of their background. I also think it's not great if we develop a pattern of reaching reflexively for military people in those roles, because it creates the expectation that the military will be the ones to fill those spots. And then you have sort of one perspective on those policies amplified. And I think it's important to remember that when, you know, the Secretary of Defense is providing her advice to the president, the Joint Staff is always, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is always available and legally empowered and required to give his military advice to the president. And so it's not about having a military perspective or not. It's about, do you have two military butts in the chairs, or do you have, you know, a senior civilian there that brings those sorts of experiences? And so I'm not opposed to it, you know, universally, but I think it's something that's best done, you know, really selectively.
I would also point out that there's a real danger if it becomes the case that those military officers are primarily affiliated with a particular political party, because one of the key sort of assets that the military has going for it is and this was mentioned in some of the questions in the Q&A, it's one of the few institutions in America that still has widespread respect across the population. And I think if we have lots of retired generals or admirals or whatever who start to be associated with a particular political party, that could be a problem for the larger military in terms of how they're viewed by the public.
My sense is that kind of behavior has increased over time. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I would say it has. I mean, it used to be the case that there was a strong norm against generals, retired generals, speaking out in that kind of way. And that has definitely eroded over time. I think the extent of, I'm not sure why that is, actually. That's a good question. I mean, I could speculate, but I think it's the extent of political conflict in the country, sort of trying to pull on, both parties want to pull on the military to back their claims because they're popular and they're respected. And we have all these news outlets that need 24/7 people talking on the air about whatever it is, and so you have to fill it with people, and so they fill it with military officers. So I do think it's increased quite a bit.
So do you think that tendency is there a connection there to the lionization of the military, and then the use by some elected officials, the association with the military, using military as a prop at times?
I mean, I would say, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you know, that's why Trump wanted the military out there with his photo op in Washington Square. It was Washington Square, wasn't it? Anyway, that he wanted the photo op out there is exactly for that reason. Yeah, I think it becomes very very unhealthy. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Andy, you have more to add to that?
I would just add two things. I completely agree with what Dr. Gelpi said there. I would add that I think part of what might be driving it is that the costs of bad foreign policy decisions are visible right now in a way that we've been at war for 20 years. I remember at the Pentagon seeing lots of folks coming through from Walter Reed, younger than I was, limbs, and they were there with their families in tow. And I mean, life is already difficult for an enlisted, member of the military because they're not paid that well. Officers are paid really well, enlisted members aren't. And so I think as that becomes more visible, people are looking for trusted voices. And I think the at least the level of trust that people have in civilian foreign policymakers is really in question at the moment. In some cases for good reason, in some cases maybe a bit exaggerated. And so I think they look for institutions that they trust, like Dr. Gelpi said. So I think that's absolutely right. The one area where I might sort of expand the argument just a little bit is to say that the use of the military for political gain, whether they're sort of formal visual props or more as sort of an argument for the legitimacy of a civil policy, is a more long-standing one than the Trump administration. So I don't think we've sort of gotten we're not free of that problem now that we've put Trump out of office. He has, and so I'm thinking back to the debates over climate change policy during the Obama administration, and one of the things that the administration did that I think was not great was they would order the Defense Department to take certain actions on climate mitigation within the military, which is fully proper. There's no issue with that at all. It was also smart, right? Often these were things that we needed to be doing. But then they would turn around in the public sphere and say, look, even the military agrees that this is a problem. Well, you just ordered the military to care. And so there's this sort of a circular logic at play, and that was politically sort of manipulative and disingenuous in my view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. So with all of these problems you've identified, they seem very serious, and to my untutored mind, difficult to resolve. Are there ways of dialing back or getting some leverage on these negative trends?
I think it's a hard problem to solve. I think, well, if you think back to the slides I was saying, right, I think there are two, and think back to Samuel Huntington, two main mechanisms for strengthening the sort of, and really what, going off of what Andy said here, I think what really needs strengthening is the civilian side of this has gotten weak and needs greater sort of oversight and input. And I think there's a couple of ways that could happen. It could happen if Congress was more willing to step up and do real oversight of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. military operations, or it could happen if we were to get more military folks into office who share values, and more John McCain's and so on in office who are more able to be in those meetings and assert themselves. I don't see either of those coming because I don't see a draft coming. Somebody asked about that in the Q&A. I think a draft is almost politically impossible because the military doesn't want it because they like to be professionalized, and the civilians don't want it because they don't want to tell their constituents they have to serve in the military. We'll see whether the current, we've been at war for 20 years now, so maybe that will cause some small uptick in the number of veterans who are serving in office, a few years from now. We do see some trickle of that. But I'm a little bit skeptical of that as a real solution because, our footprint is so small in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We're talking about such a small number of forces, of soldiers, that I don't see us getting back to the days when 70% of the people in Congress had served in the military. So I don't have an answer. Andy, you have an answer?
No, I agree with everything you just said. I might be a bit less. I'm less sort of interested in having the Congress packed with military vets. I mean, it might help. I'm less sort of certain of it. I think one sort of disadvantage that comes with that is military folks that sort of rise to that level, particularly the level of a senator like Senator McCain, sort of bring with them their sort of all their institutional biases from the military, right? And so the Navy has the folks that if you want to be a high flyer in the Navy, you're a surface warfare officer, right? In the, you're a fighter pilot or a bomber if you're in the Air Force. And, one of the big challenges that we have in adapting to a new strategic environment at the moment is where we run up against the entrenched bureaucratic interests of those parts of the military services. And so I think it sort of cuts both ways in terms of being able to make good policy and good oversight. I will say, though, that I think, a big part of the reason why politicians make these sorts of claims is because they're popular. And I suspect our best, entree point, and also the sort of the lowest hanging fruit, is in civics education. Both at the secondary and post-secondary level. People lionize the military because they don't really understand it. And I think there's a real opportunity to sort of sensitize people to what would it look like to have a more appropriate sort of posture toward the military in a democratic country. That's my take.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of questions touch on the existence of and possible responses to extremism in the military. And can you comment on how widespread you think it is, and what, if anything, can be done about it?
That's a great question. I'm happy to take an initial stab at it and then turn it over. So I don't know how widespread it is. I haven't seen good data on it. I will say, in terms of what the department is trying to do and what the government in general is trying to do, there's a push both within the Department of Defense and at the Congress to get sort of our collective arms around this. And so the most recent the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, created a new office. It's the Deputy Inspector General for overseeing diversity and inclusion. Because I think there are sort of two pieces to what we're talking about. There's the right-wing extremism, and then there's the question of white supremacy and violence within the ranks. And the two sort of frequently go together, but I don't think they're quite the same thing. And so we're approaching them sort of on parallel tracks. And so DoD has responded with both the Deputy Inspector General position. They have a diversity and inclusion board that met in July and issued a report. They've got, I think, 15 lines of effort to try to improve the pipeline of diverse recruits in order to improve retention. We have DoD instructions on the book. So these are the sort of the guiding policy documents that already prohibit extremist and hate group activity. And they're looking at changes to the UCMJ, so the military legal structure for prosecuting these cases. But one challenge is that we haven't really defined what we mean by extremism, right? So, I mean, we all agree that storming the Capitol is out of bounds, right? But there's a whole range of activities that are a bit more unclear. And so I think the department's trying to sort of set a tone that they care about it, and then kind of figure out what the details are moving forward.
Well, yeah, that raises the question of what are the parameters or perimeters maybe of the political expression by the non-coms and, for that matter, officers. Yeah, how limited are they? What can they do, and what can they not do?
That's a great question. I don't have the precise legal and policy guidelines on it. I will say that they don't give up their ability to participate in the democratic process, right, when they go into the military. And so, like, one of the sort of the most obvious violations that we see is engaging in political behavior in uniform, or standing up and saying, like, as a officer in the United States Army, I think X, right? And so that's actually true of civilians in the military too, right? So I had to sort of toe a careful line. I'm not particularly public with my political views anyway, but if I were, it's important to sort of separate the personal from the professional persona. But this is a moving standard, right? Something that the department is sort of always looking at and can revise as they go.
So, for example, take examples from both sides. So, if an officer were seen out of uniform marching in a BLM rally or marching, demonstrating in front of the Capitol on January 6th, are those within bounds?
So again, I'm not a JAG. It'd be best directed toward a JAG, but my understanding is that those are in bounds. So out of uniform, peaceful, constitutionally protected behavior is in bounds. Now, if
As
you're
long as they didn't go into the Capitol.
exactly, that's the critical thing. Like if you're at a BLM rally and you engage in violence, or you're like torching a police car or something, or if you're at the the MAGA rally and you're breaching the Capitol, I mean, those are obviously not acceptable. I think where the department is going to potentially have a challenge is the instruction that on this prohibits. I'm just reading the language about supremacist, extremist, or criminal gang doctrine, ideology, or causes. What fits in that and what is outside of it is something that they're going to have to grapple with. What counts as extremism?
I would also say I agree, like that we don't have an agreed definition on what extremism is. I mean, you said presumably storming the Capitol is out of bounds. I think we'll find out at the end of this week whether or not it's out of bounds. But
slightly different question, but yeah.
Right. Right. But I would say I do think there's definitely extremism within the U.S. military, but I'm actually a little bit less concerned about extremism in the U.S. military than I am in U.S. society more generally, because the military is a hierarchical organization with some people at the top who are committed to the facts and some things like that, and they can enforce order, and they can identify, remove, whatever, those people, police those people, if you will, in a much more effective way than civilian society can. So yes, it's there. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows whether it's more or less extreme than in civilian society. I don't have any reason to believe it's more extreme. But I find that actually less concerning than people we have no control over.
I agree completely.
Yeah, we have one comment, I think it's more of a comment than anything, from somebody who's in the military currently, and points out that the military is really the only organization that really focuses on the development of leadership, and that kind of goes together with Andy's comment on the disequilibrium between the civil service, and probably goes together with the anti-elite sensibility in today's politics. So against elites and experts.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just in terms of my own experience with senior military officers, they're an incredibly impressive bunch by and large. I mean, there are always exceptions, but by and large, they're incredibly capable people. And I think I had sort of a personal realization while working with military officers that we often use the term leadership and being in a position of power as synonyms. That somebody's a leader when they have the authority to make decisions. And I worked with a lot of folks, not all in uniform, but many of them in uniform, that were just really impressive at being able to get people to perform at a higher level than they would otherwise. And it was really impressive to watch that leadership in action. They're a very impressive group of people.
I would also note, just one last thing, I do think there are other places where civilian society stresses leadership in business and things like that. So there's a lot of leadership and leadership education out there. It's just not in civilian government. So there used to be this idea way back in the day that going into a life of civilian government was a life of public service and leadership. And I think that has eroded significantly. I think there's still a notion that the business community provides this leadership, and the military community provides this leadership, but civilian government has eroded in the last 40 years.
I'm afraid that has to be our final word. We're running out of time. I think it's just about 5 o'clock. I want to thank both of you for great commentary and response to questions. I want to thank our listeners and viewers today for their wonderful questions and for their attentiveness. I hope that everybody has learned something. I certainly have. So thank you and have a good evening.